Well, adding bass notes into your chord playing is a really easy and effective way of sort of spicing up your playing, really, especially on an acoustic guitar. Just strumming chords is a really good way of embellishing the chord. A really simple way to approach this to begin with is just to think of a simple rule, which is when you're playing a bass note for a chord, it needs to be one of the notes that's already in the chord. And that's a really obvious but simple way to think of it. So if I'm playing a G chord, my bass note needs to be probably a low note because we're calling it a bass note, so it's not going to be like this or this. But these lower ones, they could all be considered bass notes. So I think if you think of the thickest 3 strings, that's where your bass notes are probably going to be found. So I could use this as my bass note because it's in the chord. I could use this, that's also in the chord, because I'm not changing the chord, I'm just holding it. And I could use that. And I could go between them. Now most of the time, when people do this, their first bass note is the root note of the chord, and the root note is the note that's got the same name as the chord. So in a G chord or G major chord, the root note is the G. And there are 3 Gs in this particular chord, but we're going for the bass one, the low one. Normally, in most chord shapes, the root note is the lowest note of the chord. Not always, but usually is. So in this example, that's the G, and it's also the lowest G. So I'm going to hit that note and then strum. It doesn't matter if I catch that note again as part of the strum, but what I'm mostly aiming for is hit that note and then try to aim for the other 5 strings more when I'm strumming. But it doesn't matter if I catch it again. So that would sound like. And if I enter another chord, like maybe a D chord, my bass note, the lowest note in that chord, is the 4th string open, which is a D. So it's the root note. So I could go. And then maybe a C chord. My lowest note in the chord is that note there, which is a C. And it's a bass note. So it's. So if I put those 3 together, it would sound like this. So that works well, and it's a bit more interesting than just strumming without the bass notes. But it's still a little bit basic sounding and a bit kind of pedestrian sounding. So what you can do to liven it up a bit is alternate between playing the bass note we've just been talking about and one of the other notes from the chord. And there are kind of theoretical rules about this that you can follow where you have to play a certain note from the chord. But I'm not going to get into that now. I'm just going to say that you can play any other note from the chord as long as it's not the one that you've just played. We still want to stick with bass notes though, so I'm not going to go from there to there. I'll probably go for this one next, or maybe that one. So on the G chord, if I just show you an example where I play the G bass note followed by the 5th string, and then I'll do the same thing using the 4th string instead. Both of those work. I could also double the speed of the bass notes, or double the frequency of the bass notes by doing this. Or with the D. Or you could actually establish some kind of pattern where you use both of those other bass notes and alternate between those. So I could do, like, in terms of string numbers, I could do 6, 4, 6, 5. interesting. If I take another chord as an example, let's go back to the D that I played earlier. As I said, the bass note was the D on the 4th string open. I want to use another note from the chord. Now here it gets a bit tricky because we're only using this one of the 3 bass strings. Now I could go onto the next string and go, but it's a little bit high sounding for me, and I think it doesn't really sound much like a bass line anymore. So I want to go lower if possible. So what I can do is look at, it gets a bit more complicated, but I can look at the D chord and think, what was that note I was playing there? We know this one's D. What's that note? That one's an A, because you've got G, G sharp, A. So that note is an A. So we know that there's an A in that chord. Well, this string, this bass string open is an A. So I could use that instead of that. So that becomes this. And that's something you'll definitely have heard before. Let's take another example. Let's take a C chord. So bass note we established earlier was on the 5th string, 3rd fret. So I have got another bass string involved, thinking of these 3 as the bass strings. So I've got another one involved in that chord already. So I could use that note. So I could go. And I think that works. Also, I could do what I did with the D and look at that note and work out what it is. It's actually an E note. And think, well, there's an E note here. So I could go. It's a little bit less obvious sounding, that one. It's quite nice, but it's a little bit more unusual. But it does work. Something else that a lot of people would do with the C chord, and you'll have heard this, is look at one of the other notes of the chord, which is this one. That's a G, but as I said with the D chord, we don't really want to go onto that string. It's not really a bass string. So because we know that's a G note, find another G note lower. And there's one right here, which was in our G chord. Well, what I could do is just move that finger across to alternate between playing a C bass note and then this G bass note. So I go like this. And that's quite effective, and you'll have heard that before. So I'll just demonstrate this by playing around those 3 chords, G, D and C, and just changing between the bass notes. And that's how it works, and you could do this with any chords. So I'm picking these ones just as an example in the key of G, but if you're in a different key, maybe even using bar chords, it still works in the same way. Let's say I was playing an A bar chord here and going to a C sharp minor and then a D. Then I could go like this for the A, play the bass note, which is the A, or alternate with maybe this note. Doesn't matter what that note is called, we know it's in the chord, so we know it's going to work. C sharp minor, this note, the lowest note of the chord is the C sharp, so that's going to work. Then I could still go to this other bass string. Or I could do what I was doing with some of the chords in the other example. Find this note, it's a G sharp, there's one there. So even though that's not part of that shape, I could still move my finger to cover it and go. Or even instead of moving, I could actually start with it over all of them and go. And then the other chord was D, played as a bar chord. I could do the same thing I did with the C sharp, either this, or cover that one as well, because this note is the same note as that. They're both A's. that kind of thing. So if I put them together. Okay, and that's it in a nutshell. That's how you go about adding in bass notes to your chords without actually moving outside of the chord tones. So you're only using notes that are in the chord. Now, there's another way you can do this as well by adding extra notes, which is from the scale rather than just looking at the chords. But that's another lesson that I'm going to do. Okay, thanks for watching.